I'm from Angel Branch in North London of Socialist Workers' Party, and I teach in Islington. And today's speaker is Mark Steele, who's a long-standing member of the Socialist Workers' Party and a well-known journalist, as I'm sure you also all know. He's going to speak for about 35 minutes, after which there will be time for contributions, and I'd ask you please to put your name on a speaker slip and just a quick summary of what you want to say, which just helps us to ensure that we get a broad debate so that we can balance out different points that people want to make. Thanks very much.
A little while ago, the contradictions of religion I noticed when I went to a Pentecostal church to do. The contradiction didn't arrive because I went to a Pentecostal church because I was wavering a little bit politically. That wasn't the reason I went there, but I went there to write an article, and out came this sort of little band at the beginning, and they started singing, and it was all very joyous. It wasn't like Church of England at all. It all looked a bit of fun, really. Everybody was up and singing, and there was tambourines, and everyone was going for it. And I noticed the first verse of the hymn that everybody was singing, and I remembered it absolutely. I swear this is exact first verse. It was, "God reigns over all of us. He kills all his enemies, and the hills melt like wax. La 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 la." And it struck me that there was certainly a case for saying there is a contradiction, really, in religion, as there was in those verses. It was the case when you start puzzling these things. Religion, there's something that troubles me. It seems to me you don't start when you go to Sunday school and things like that, with really sort of rather miserable English sort of introduction to religion as a kid, and you don't start thinking there is no God. It takes various different forms, doesn't it? I remember thinking, hang on a minute here, the thing is, the question not is there or isn't there a God, hang on a minute, he floods the entire planet because people aren't worshipping him enough. He decides to make everybody speak different languages all over the world so that people couldn't understand each other as punishment because they tried to build a tower to get near him. He destroys an entire city because he doesn't agree with their sexual practice, and then when one woman has the audacity to watch him do it, he thinks, oh dear, a witness, and he turns her into a pillar of salt. And I remember thinking, the question is not is there or isn't there a God, but if there is one, what on earth do you want to worship a bastard like that for? And so it goes on. You read the Bible. I'm sure you're all familiar with Deuteronomy, but if you're not, Deuteronomy: if a man takes a wife and after lying with her dislikes her, saying, I married this woman but I did not find proof of her virginity, the girl's father and mother shall bring proof that she was a virgin to the elders of the gate. If, however, the charge is true, she shall be brought to the door of her father's house, where the men of the town shall stone her to death. Deuteronomy. That's the book. Well, we worship the book. This is the Christian thing. We worship this, stoning people to death for not being virgins when they're married. Luke, even, the New Testament, which is sort of the moderate wing of the thing normally, not so many locusts in the New Testament, but Luke, talking about the wrath of God. This will be the time of punishment in fulfilment of all that has been written. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. The wrath of God is an anger. I mean, at least NATO say they don't mean to create civilian casualties. These bastards proud of them. And so it goes on. I've been once when I was sort of without anything to read in a hotel room, I read the Bible, the Book of Esther. Extraordinary story, the Book of Esther. Marvellous story. Ends up with 3 days of absolute slaughter, and the last few verses of it are all, and there was much killing, and limbs were severed, and there was much blood, and it was good. And heads were chopped off, and it was good. And this is now, that's the basis for those battles are the basis for the Jewish festival of Purim. Extraordinary, all this. So, utterly irrational. What is there to say about it? Apart from, of course, not just that it's utterly irrational, it is oppressive, even in the sense that someone like myself went to this miserable little school, and I just remember that thing where you all have to sing the hymns. It makes me laugh, really, when you get these sort of Daily Telegraph types who talk about the indoctrination. Kids are being indoctrinated by these liberal ideas. And I remember we had to sing hymns. No choice about this. We have to sing hymns, and sometimes you sort of go burr, 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 just to sort of cheat. You think, I cheated, I just went burr, 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 and somehow the teacher knows and comes down and whacks you and says, sing, and you have to sing this hymn. And the hymn, I remember one the words to it that went, "Sun and moon bow down before him." That's the words to one of them. And you think, well, these people who moan about this is indoctrination. I mean, like left-wing teachers might teach you that Che Guevara had some good ideas or something. They don't generally teach you that the sun and moon bow down before him. So what is there to say about it? Marx, after all, one of the most famous quotes he made, the opium of the people, religion is the opium of the people, therefore, what is there to say about it? It's irrational, it's oppressive, that you would think is the end of it. It's the opium of the people, it's just to oppress people, it's there to con people, pie in the sky when you die. Don't fight for a better life now, wait until heaven, and then thankfully we don't have to pay for that, that's someone else who pays for that, and all is well. This, of course, is a caricature of Marxist attitudes towards religion that was helped greatly by one Joseph Stalin, because the Stalinists had the theory of religion was we can tolerate no opposition, there is one way, there is one truth. Sound a bit biblical, there is one truth, which is our truth. We cannot tolerate any opposition, and therefore any ideological opposition, even the church, cannot be tolerated. And so, and the practice of that, there was that the Russian church was banned, of course. That was that therefore helps the caricature, it seems to me. And yet, it isn't quite as simple as that, is it? Because it's not just true that everybody who believes in God, that all religion is just utterly ridiculous, irrational and oppressive. You listen to the speeches of Martin Luther King and you think, oh, I want to be religious. Sometimes they're fantastic imagery and so on. Or there's this speech, one of my favourite speeches of all time, by a man called Owen Lovejoy, who was an abolitionist just before the American Civil War. And he was accused of being, in their words, a nigger stealer. So he got up in the Senate and he made this speech. He said, "Yes, I do assist fugitives to escape. Proclaim it upon the housetops. Write it upon every leaf that trembles in the forest. Make it blaze from the sun at high noon and shine forth in the radiance of every star that bedecks the firmament of God. Let it echo through the arches of heaven and reverberate and bellow through the deep gorges of hell, where slave catchers will be very likely to hear it." Owen Lovejoy lives at Princeton, Illinois, and he aids every fugitive that comes to his door and asks for it. Thou invisible demon of slavery, dost thou think to cross my humble threshold and forbid me to give bread to the hungry and shelter to the homeless? I bid you defiance in the name of God. And I think, thank God that man was religious. That is a speech worth making. It almost makes you want to believe in it. So now God, therefore, isn't just this sort of oppressive character. Marx obviously had to have a different attitude than to just say religion is just rubbish, anybody who believes it is an idiot. Have to be a little bit more sophisticated than that. He would be a little bit more sophisticated because, of course, there had been questioning of religion before Marx, the Enlightenment, particularly in France. This group of people who questioned all the ideas of religion, mainly because their idea was that all the Enlightenment were really united by the idea that mystical ideas dominate society, irrational ideas, the idea that God has an envoy on earth, which is the king. This is an irrational idea, and it thwarts the development of mankind. Science and reason surely are the way that mankind can develop and build things and chart the way around the world and so on, and develop themselves culturally and in all these ways. Ideas, if we change the ideas at the top of society, then we have to change religion, and then society will move forward from there. And they were very impressive. I mean, Voltaire wrote a book about the 1750s, something like that, his book Candide, in response to an incident where there was an earthquake in Lisbon, at which thousands of people were killed, and there was one clergyman, an academic, who said that even though this earthquake had killed thousands of people, it was still the best of all possible worlds. Who are we to know why God does this thing? But it's the best of all possible. Everything that happens, in other words, is the best of all possible worlds. And Voltaire wrote this very, very funny, brilliant book called Candide, which is just a satire on it, where the most outrageous, ridiculous soap opera things, I mean, it actually puts Brookside to shame, this book. The most absurd things take place, and all the time there is this one character, Dr. Pangloss. Oh, well, it's the best of all possible worlds. A satire on the church. To Tom Paine, at the other end of the Enlightenment, if you like, who, from memory, he'd read the Bible so well he knew it from memory, and when he was in jail in France, he wrote a book called The Age of Reason. And in The Age of Reason, he tore the Bible to shreds. He proved, for example, that the first 5 books of the Old Testament had not been written by Moses. I mean, what a thing to say at the time. You know, they weren't written by Moses, but they're the books of Moses. Of course they were written by Moses, but he notices that 3 of the old books of Moses refer to Moses in the third person. So says things like, and Moses said unto the Lord, and the Lord said unto Moses, and so on. And he thought this was quite peculiar. Fair enough, some people talk about themselves in the third person when they're writing. That does happen, but it's strange that he does it in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, but not in Exodus. I mean, why did he sort of suddenly have a change in writing style? This is Blue Period or something? What was this that Moses was doing? And then he says something else about Moses. He says, all right, so we'll forgive him that. But he says, however, in Numbers chapter 12, verse 3, it says, he writes, now the man Moses was very meek above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. And Tom Paine says, if Moses said this of himself, instead of being the meekest of men, he was in fact the most vain and arrogant. And he also has some brilliant fun in there. He says, well, look, Jesus, if we're to believe it, came down on this earth to suffer. That was his job, and he ended up on a cross. Therefore, he achieved his task. He succeeded. So really, if he was really about suffering, then God would have just let him live quite comfortably and happy until he was very old, and then he would have really suffered, thinking, but I'm here to suffer. And quite what the ruling class made of that philosophical conundrum is not recorded. So brilliant ideas then, all these marvellous ideas, criticising religion, science above reason. It's not reasonable, it doesn't make sense. Marx, though, coming at it from a different angle, not because he was more brilliant, of course, but because there'd been a thing, the French Revolution, in the meantime, that sort of confirmed that these ideas, the bourgeois revolution had happened, the bourgeoisie was in power now, their ideas were in control now, increasingly across the world. And yet, there was still religion, and yet there was still inequality. The ideas of society, clearly, Marx said, do not drive society. Ideas come from society. It's the society in which we live that gives birth to those ideas. Being determines consciousness, not the other way round, to put it another way. And so he says, there is a social origin, there is a materialist, historical materialist origins of religion. For instance, people are really succumb to the forces of nature. Mankind, in the early stages of their existence, can't control nature. The one sort of way that they can feel that they have some control over nature is to create this image, to create this god, whatever gods it is, and to feel that you have some control over those because you can pray to them and so on. So, and you know, there are it's not just a conspiracy. Some of the Enlightenment said religion is just a conspiracy to keep the poor in their place. He said, well, how can it be a conspiracy? I don't think he was aware of this at the time, but we know now that Neanderthal man had burial sites where they buried people with various weapons and so on for the next world. Clearly, now was there a conspiracy in Neanderthal society? I very much doubt it. There's something more to it than that. That's the social origins of religion. Also, if you look at any specific religion, any specific religious ideas, it only really makes sense if you say, what was the society that bred those ideas? Then you can begin to understand them. For instance, the origins of Christianity. Now, either you can say, well, there was a sort of proletarian group of people on the edge of the cities, particularly in Jerusalem, in the Middle East, that people that felt estranged from the Romans, for obvious reasons. They didn't get on very well with the Romans, and so they developed their own religion, really, which had a tinge of radicalism at the time, which talked in slightly different terms from the slave owners. If you look at that contradiction, you can see where our Christianity originated. On the other hand, if it's just driven by ideas, what was it? It must have been presumably then that just a bunch of people, for no apparent reason, suddenly said, you know, I don't think Mars is the god of war, you know. I don't think he's the god. I don't think these gods, I think there's probably, I don't know, it just seems to me that there is one god who's divided into three people, and I think he's got a son who I think is probably that bloke with a beard who wanders around the wilderness over there. Don't ask me why, it just seems to be that way. I don't know, just an instinct, I suppose, and for some reason it caught on. Clearly this is not the case. There was social origins. Of course, they adapted their ideas from the religion that had gone before, and so on. In this country, of course, Christmas was an old pagan festival that, because it was the shortest day and so on, the winter solstice, they adapt these ideas, many of the religious ideas, the story of Jacob and the story of the famine and the story of Jonah and the whale, all these can be found in religions that preceded it. They took the story, nicked the stories, probably didn't even give them a royalty, and here we are with our new religion. That seems to make much more sense. It seems to make much more sense that Islam derived from the fact that there was merchants in society who had a different sort of attitude to life. Mecca and Medina were trading cities, therefore there was a different way of looking at the world and so on. Trotsky, for example, writes, if I find this, Trotsky says, religion is a kind of fictitious knowledge of the universe, and the fiction has two sources, the weakness of man before nature and the incoherence of social relations. Fearing nature or ignoring it, man in society endeavoured to meet his needs by creating fantastic images and kneeling before his own creations. In other words, it derived, man created God, and that was the origins of religion. For those reasons, kneeling before their own creations. On other words, on the other hand, there was Bakunin, the anarchist, who had a slightly different attitude. Now, Bakunin had a marvellous sort of take on it, if you like. He wrote a book, God and the State, where he inverted a phrase from Voltaire. Voltaire had said if God did not exist, it would be necessary to create him. And so Bakunin, in this sort of anarchist fit of anger that the anarchists are prone to have, had this marvellous little sort of subheading to the book, which was, if God existed, it would be necessary to abolish him. And he added to that, the leading institutions of man's enslavement are the church and the state. Every church has been a loyal ally of the state in the subjugation of mankind. Right, okay, good angry anti-religious rant. But is that the case? Every church, all religion, always one of the main things, along with the state, that subjugates mankind. So, if you look at this another way, for example, let's going to go through one sort of little period in history that I think sort of shows some of the arguments about religion that Marxists can have. The English Civil War. Now, yes, it was. The church was part of, aligned with the state, crucially. And not only that, it was clearly part of the subjugation of mankind. For example, the church educated children. It controlled people's lives. It collected and distributed what little relief there was for the poor. The parson's sermon was the news of the week, the news of the parish would be told to you by the parson. That would be the equivalent of the 6 o'clock news or whatever. Entertainment was provided by the church. There was an edict which came from Elizabeth I, which went round to all the parsons, who were hand-picked, parsons, bishops, all picked by the state. And an edict went round from Elizabeth I that said that every sermon, every week, must have 6 parts. This completely directing the thing, must have 6 parts, and more or less every week something would come round telling the parsons what to say. It was a sort of Elizabethan party notes, I suppose, that used to come round and sort of direct people for the week. And the last part, which I think probably would not be in party notes, the last part of the lead edict that dictated this said that every sermon must end condemning disobedience and wilful rebellion. The pew in the church represented status, the noble at the front, the smaller landowners here, and so on, back to the poor old agricultural labourers crushed up in the back there. It was illegal not to go. It was illegal to go to a church that was outside your own parish. There was probably a few middle-class parents who said, oh, wait, we know that the local churches are good, but... But, you know, what can you do? I mean, we've sent our children to the church in the other parish because, well, you can't have principles when it comes to the kids, can you? So there we are then. Bakunin's right. The church, religion, is an ally of the state and is there for no other reason than to subjugate mankind. Except that, of course, the people that started to rebel against that were equally religious. It's not the case that the people that rebelled against that just said, right, well, religion therefore is rubbish, we don't want anything to do with it, there is no God, we're rebelling against you. Not the case. Of course, the Puritans had a very different idea, an idea of an individual relationship with God, completely foreign that to the idea of certainly of the Catholic Church, but also of the Protestant Church that reformed itself under Henry VIII. Still followed the icon, still had a priest that stood there and told you what to just repeat these phrases and so on. There was no individual relationship with God. Everything went through the priest. It's the way the Puritans saw it was that the priest was a sort of secretary, really, the God's secretary. And if you tried to get hold of God, then the priest would be there saying, "I'm afraid he's in a meeting at the moment. Can he?" I'll give him a message, something like that. There was no individual relationship with God. The Puritans had a completely different idea about God, an individual relationship. Now, again, why was that? Cromwell talked about a wrestling with God. There was no wrestling with God in the old church. God, you just asked God, please don't send me to hell, really. That was about it. And then you just followed the routines. An individual relationship with God. Why was that? Was that because they just suddenly thought, well, I don't know, it just seems that there should be a different sort of religion? Of course not. It reflected their whole new ideology of society, the new status of people, craftsmen, that didn't just work and so on until the work was finished, as you would in the fields. But you worked and you could have aspirations when you were a small craftsman. And section of society that were craftsmen, they had control over their own work, but the more work they did, the more wealth they created, it seems, something that didn't apply on the land. The individual family units were a new thing in society, really, before people really ate and slept and so on as part of the communal village, really. Now there was the household units. Your sort of competition was against the people next door and so on. You thought individually, therefore an individual relationship with God. And this clearly made some sense, because then when people started to rebel against it, rebel for all sorts of reasons that were to do with the subjects of other meetings. Charles I saying that the people that before didn't have to pay a certain sort of tax suddenly had to pay it, and so on. All these sort of restrictions from the old society that the Puritans, the craftsmen, the middling sort as they called, all these ideas that they wanted to overthrow. That's why they set out to overthrow the old regime, or certainly to challenge it. They didn't set out to challenge it because of the religious ideas, but then they had to adapt their own religious ideas to suit their rebellion. And it was a rebellion, extraordinary. I mean, just one thing, Archbishop Laud, who was one of the most hated people of the figure, lived at Lambeth Palace but a mile away, and he wrote in his diary one night about a certain demonstration where he said, "At midnight my house was beset by 500 rascal routers. I strengthened the house as well as I could, but they continued for 2 full hours. It's 500 people down there attacking the Lambeth Palace. Now, the reason he didn't finish up the story was because he had to flee out of a back tunnel that led down to the river, where, dressed as a woman apparently, he got in a boat and sailed across the Thames. The Archbishop. I think anyone walking past must have thought, my God, they're filming a scene of Monty Python. There's an Archbishop in women's clothing rowing across the Thames. A man called Walter Backenquoll, who was the Dean of Durham, wrote about a church in Edinburgh. He said, "No sooner was the book opened by the Dean of Edinburgh," because I was explaining here, what's happening is that the part of the rebellion here is that Charles I is ordering the Scottish churches to use the English prayer books. The old-fashioned prayer books. No sooner was the book opened by the Dean of Edinburgh, but a number of the meaner sort raised such a barbarous hubbub that not anyone could be heard. The bishop stepped into the pulpit, whereupon a stool was thrown at him. Had it not been through the hand of one present diverting it with his hand, it would have endangered his life. Which I think is been a bit of a drama queen there. I've never heard of a... By God, if that stool had hit you, sir, you'd have been dead, definitely. Probably a bit of an exaggeration from Walter Backenquoll, but nonetheless, here is a completely different set. Now, they are not about the subjugation of mankind. These are people rebelling and yet using religious ideology to do it. And not only that, even more than that, of course, as the Civil War unfolded, then, just as in any revolution, this extraordinary flowering of ideas that took place. There was, of course, we know about the levellers and the diggers and so on. I'm not going to go, especially as Tony Benn's just been there, and I'm sure he mentioned them, but... No, I'm trying to be complimentary about them. I should mention them. I mean, levellers and diggers are a marvellous example, really, of great rebellion, and they sort of unearthed all this extraordinary, overturned all sorts of extraordinary ideology and so on. And yet, it wasn't just the levellers and diggers. There were just extraordinary sects that grew up, that had ideas, that come up with ideas that were almost would have been unthinkable but a few years earlier. The Ranters, there was a section of the group called the Ranters, for example, that decided that the original sin story, Adam and Eve and the apple and the snake, that the real thing about that story was that it was only after Eve took the apple, it was only after this that mankind discovered each other's bodies and were able therefore to enjoy themselves. Therefore, what God was telling us through this story is that sin is good. And therefore at Ranters' meetings, they used to insist that they did things. They used to break into churches and go up to the altar and just swear, just stand at the altar just swearing, because God wants us to do this. There was extraordinary things. They had the most extraordinary sexually liberated ideas and so on as well, the Ranters. And there were other, but not just the Ranters. There was one sect led by a man called George Foster, who said, God, that mighty leveller, will root up all powers, whether they be king or parliament, and will make all common. And if any say, oh, why do they take away my goods? The answer will be, we have need of them, and we, in the name of the Creator, take them for to make use of them. And what will you say to this, O great rich men that have abundance? I pass this sentence on you, rich men, that I will utterly destroy you. Now, that clearly is not, George Foster is clearly not there using religion as a way of subjugating mankind, subjugating rich kind, but that's about it. George Fox, another one. O ye great men and rich men of the earth, weep and howl for your misery that is coming. The fire is kindled, the day of the Lord is appearing, a day of howling. Now, I would love to be wrong in those circumstances, and if the Lord did come down against all the sort of rational thought that I have, if the Lord did come down and it was a big day of howling for the rich, then I'd say, all right, hands up, I've never believed with you, but respect. What an extraordinary! There was a group that believed so passionately that the Bible was really was heathen, if you like. That God, if there was a God, that what he wanted was obviously what was the opposite of what the Bible told us, which was just subservience and so on. That they made it, therefore, their mission, to be a member, you had to break all 10 commandments. Well, they were very good. They left out murder. We don't have to murder anyone, but apart from that, we do have to leave out. We have to all 10 commands we have to break, which means that presumably they must have gone round knocking on doors to find someone who had an ox that they could covet. But what an extraordinary thing here. Two things. First of all, that clearly religion is not being used here as a way to subjugate mankind. It's being adapted as part of the fight against the subjugation. But also, the extraordinary thing, how fragile religion appears. People believe this. I mean, you think, how deep can an ideology go? How deep can it go that people believe not only that their whole lives are controlled by this deity, not only do they believe that, they believe the afterlife. They believe this character created the heavens and everything, the universe, everything that we can see, everything that we do from morning to night is controlled by this deity, character, God. And yet, in an upheaval in society, they completely chuck the lot out of the whole window. They don't go, there's no God. Of course, people took to atheism, but they completely subvert it. Similarly, I won't go to length, but similarly in the French Revolution, extraordinary. It's a bit different because the Catholic Church was such a huge part of the old state machinery, owned most of the land and so on. But nonetheless, in a few years of the French Revolution, this extraordinary upheaval where people were burning down Catholic churches, the Jacobins ordered the complete destruction of the Catholic Church. But, quite interesting, see, when the Jacobins took power, they then had a little bit of a panic, if you like, because they realised, we are creating a new bourgeois society. They wouldn't have put it in those terms, that's what they were doing. And so there was a need for religion. There is a need for religion. There is an element of conspiracy, and particularly in those days, they invented a whole new religion, the cult of the supreme being. We must get people. Didn't take off because the Jacobins were overthrown. But they invented a whole new religion. There was an element of conspiracy for them. And yet, if you look at other periods, Black America, certainly, the religious hypocrisy in the States, we know, is extraordinary. Ronald Reagan, all these ridiculous, fiery, dreadful, appalling people with their tub thumping and their Bibles and so on, and all these dreadful people. And yet, if you also, of course, the most just equally fervent about religion in America is the black churches. No question about that. Now, if you just took an ideological stand on it, religion is just ideology, then you would have the most bizarre sort of line on the thing. Oh, we are all as bad as each other. The Ronald Reagan and the Pat Buchanan and the black churches all believe in God, therefore you're all mad. Clearly, that is complete nonsense to take that attitude. Now, how could that be? And that's where I come to I'm sure some people know it, the whole quote, the one that is not part of the caricature. Religion is the opium of the people, said Marx. He didn't just say that. The full quote is that religion is the heart in a heartless world. It is the sigh of the oppressed. It is the opium of the people. Suddenly it means the opposite of what the caricature means. It doesn't just mean these stupid people as if it's a diversion, the caricature of socialism, as if it's like alcohol or sport or something, just a silly thing for people to do. Not at all like that. That it is the heart in a heartless world. There is a reason why people fall to it, where everything falls apart, when you have no control over your life. Not now just because human beings don't have control of nature, but because of the social relations, because the rich people control everything that you do, morning, noon and night and so on. It's the only thing that appears to offer a soul, a heart in the heartless world. It's the sigh of the oppressed. And therefore, of course, these things can be extraordinarily contradictory. When you see religion as part of the material world, of course, then it makes sense that people can have religious ideas at the same time as fighting back, and then the two things, the resistance, the ideas of resistance and the ideas of religion, get intertwined and intermingled, making the most extraordinary sort of cocktail of ideas. And certainly in Black America, just two examples to give you. I mean, there was a marvellous character in Alabama, a black man called Jose Hudson, who joined the Communist Party in the 30s, got a brilliant biography. And he wrote this, some of his stories are absolutely extraordinary. There's one in particular, is the Communist Party had to work alongside the people that went to the churches. Of course they did. You couldn't just ignore these people and say, well, they're all religious, they all believe in this nonsense in the Bible, what can we have to do with them? They worked alongside them, of course they did. And there's a marvellous story where there was one particular reverend called Reverend Sears. And Reverend Sears, they worked out, had been fingering a couple of the Communist Party members to the police, to the local police. Now, there is a real world. There's part of the material world that you can fight him on. If you start arguing with Reverend Sears about God, you get nowhere. However, we can argue with him, don't go down to the police and shop the local Communist Party members to the police, saying what they've been doing. That, you can get support from all the people that do believe in God, and so on. And so, what they did was that they got various people, quite a lot of people didn't trust this Reverend Sears. They thought there was something a bit suspicious about him. So they got everybody to go along to the church one week and stand up and say, Reverend Sears, did you or did you not grass up Doc, was the bloke's name, to the police? Account for yourself. Where were you? Give us an alibi. Where were you? And one after the other, and he's trying to do his sermon, and he's rattling along, and one after the other, everybody's getting up, saying, but no, we don't want to know about this, Reverend Sears, until you tell us. Where were you? Where were you last Saturday? We think that you were off to the police. Suddenly, he says, Reverend Sears bent down and picked up a machine gun. At which point, in the biography, it says, at which point everybody screamed, IE, and then about 5 I's, which I expect you would shout when the Reverend picks up a machine gun, and ran out. Now, as a result of this, the Communist Party then ran a campaign to try and get him driven out of town, which they didn't do, but his church collapsed and so on. And I wish I had a happy ending to that story, but the man's church was, in effect, ruined, because they approached it, it seems to me, exactly right. They took on the material arguments, and then, all right, then we'll leave you to draw your own conclusions, good people, about Reverend Sears and the church and so on. Or, even more starkly, it seems to me, the story of Malcolm X. The story of Malcolm X seems to me a marvellous example, really, of religion, the sigh of the oppressed, the heart of the heartless world, the opium of the people. If you just look at it ideologically, so you take Malcolm X's ideas, he joins the Nation of Islam. If you just look at the ideas, he joins this Nation of Islam, and the Nation of Islam's idea is this is what he's told when he's in prison, that there was a man called Dr. Jacob, who came down, sent by the devil, and he came down to an island in the Mediterranean where he had to breed lighter-skinned people. And he got the most lightly-skinned people he could, and he bred them. And after several hundred years, when he'd got people that were a little bit lighter, he sent them off into Asia. And then a few hundred years later, he got some even more lightly-skinned people, and he sent them off to China. And then eventually he got white people, and these were full devils, and he sent the devils off to destroy all good people in the world. Now, just looked at ideologically, you think, well, that's just bonkers, and that's that. There's the end of it. Except the extraordinary thing, and I think this comes out marvellously in the biography, the extraordinary thing is when you look at it from the point of view of Malcolm X's life, he's in prison, and he looks back at his life, and he says, my father was murdered by white men, and the house was burnt down, the white police never found anybody or even looked for the people who did it. When the house was burnt down, we got no insurance because the white insurance company swindled everybody. I wanted to become a lawyer, but my white teacher said, you'll never become a lawyer, it's a white man's job. From there I ended up running lottery numbers and so on illegally. I went out burglaring. The white people I was with didn't get done by the police. I got sent to jail where I'm treated with enormous brutality by white people who run the prison. When you look at his whole story of his life, then you understand, of course somebody coming along with this idea that in abstract is nonsense, of course it makes sense, and therefore to condemn him for the ideas would make no sense. What, of course, any decent person, any sort of decent fighter at all would say would be, of course you're right to start fighting back at this point. I don't agree with you about the religion, but I can understand that for you it is the heart in a heartless world, the sigh of the oppressed. Marxism Marx's account makes absolute sense, and so on. If you apply that to everything, Catholicism, on the one hand, of course, the Catholic Church, what an evil thing it is. I remember I went to the Vatican. No matter how much you sort of, believe me, I did not have illusions in the Catholic Church before I went into the Vatican. But anyone, I promise you go to the Vatican and you walk around there for 5 minutes and you just think, you thieving bastards! You've bloody got everything! They've nicked everything, the Catholic Church. And you could go on. Why is there no welfare state in Ireland? Because the Catholic Church, as part of the state after the Second World War, insisted there should be no Catholic Church in Ireland because that would undermine the family, and so on. You could go on and on and on. I mean, Eamon McCann's in this story. I wish I could remember the name of the character, but Eamon McCann's talking about someone at the moment who is on the road to sainthood. You get ordained. The Catholic Church make you, they sit there and have their meeting and they say, yes, this person is we're going to make you a saint. A Croatian Catholic from the Second World War who converted so many people to the Catholic Church that therefore he's going to be a saint. All right, fair enough. Except that this particular man who's going to be a saint once led a huge march in Croatia during the Second World War and spoke at the rally where his opening words were, "We must all thank God for Hitler." Now, this is the Catholic Church. There's only one attitude therefore, Catholicism, rubbish, of course it is. Mother Teresa, one of the most evil people that can have stalked the 20th century, surely, this extraordinary woman. Not evil because she's a Catholic, she's evil because how she uses Catholicism, how she forced AIDS sufferers in her hostels, forced them to go without any medication at all, because only if they died in agony would they be redeeming themselves in the eyes of the Lord. Whose personal friends included such lovely people as Ceausescu and so on. Certainly very friendly with Reagan because she was working with him and dear Nancy to try and get abortion made illegal and so on. A dreadful story where in the hostels where there was one time, an account from one worker in one of the hostels, where sick people who were dying in one of the hostels were queuing up. They were made to queue up, and Mother Teresa would dab a sort of handkerchief on their head. And there was a woman who said, oh, so that is a little bit of care then, because they didn't even get that normally, not even a Fensick, nothing, don't have a hangover if you're in Mother Teresa's hostel, nothing. So they were dabbing this bit of water on their heads, and the account of the aid worker said, well, this is unusual, Mother Teresa, are you saying you are applying some sort of medication now? And she said, no, you see, these people are Muslims and I'm baptising them. Now that, it seems to me, is just about the depths of evil. Almost, Mother Teresa does. I'm sure this is her job, and she's worked with me. She does make me want to believe in heaven and hell, because I'm sure she'd burn for fucking eternity. And yet, of course, in 1980-81, when Solidarity in Poland, one of the most marvellous sort of movements there's been over the last 20-25 years, the movement of 11 million workers who joined Solidarity in Poland, and one of their demands, they had all these marvellous demands, access to the media and so on, all these demands over and above the thing about the right to organise, the right to work and so on, and all the pay and all the things you would expect. On top of that, one of their main demands was the right to have chapels in the workplace, the right for religious freedom and so on. Part and parcel of the confidence. To just talk about it being the subjugation of mankind, therefore would make no sense. And so, in conclusion, I'll say this. I mean, first of all, also to argue about just to religion on an ideological basis, extraordinary. Religion is a marvellously flexible phenomenon, incredible. No one, I'm sure, would have believed, I don't even Marx would have believed, it would have withstood, that religion could withstand the extraordinary scientific changes there would have been. Who would have thought, when Copernicus said that the Earth is not at the centre of the universe, that removed a huge sort of lever from a huge sort of block of religion. The Earth is not even the centre of the universe anymore. Darwin comes along, has almost exactly the same panic as Copernicus. He comes up with this theory and waited 20 years before publishing it because he thought, I am going to cause the end of all religion, and what's this going to mean? And yet it somehow survives it. It's an extraordinary thing now where really the sort of idea of the modern church, most modern Western churches is, oh yes, there's the Bible and the resurrection and all these things about fishes and loaves, but we don't take those literally, That's just a bit of a game. This was the central premise premise of the whole of religion. Oh, never mind that. I know we said that. Almost like Jamie Shea. I know we said that yesterday, but we didn't really mean it. We found a new thing now. That's all yesterday. Oh, and I don't know. And so it is extraordinarily flexible. Liberation theology shows how extraordinarily flexible it is. When you get, for example, you get a quote. One quote they use, the liberation theologists, from Exodus. They say, I have witnessed the affliction of my people and have heard their cry of complaint against the slave drivers. So I know well that they are suffering. This one little bit that they take from Exodus, in the midst of all this rubbish, this terrible rubbish, people getting burnt and turned into pillars of salt and so on. And yet the liberation theologists take this one little passage and they say that proves really that Christianity is about resistance and so on, because he's heard the suffering. You can take whatever you like from it. Now, there's no doubting at all, no question at all, that the liberation theologists are incredibly courageous people. They went out really as part of the sort of movement that there was in the 60s in various bits of the world to go out into the poor and preach to those, really, part of the sort of Che Guevara type movements and so on, and overthrow the system, all this. They did all that. They do all that. And yet, because they remove all the sort of the nonsense from Jesus, you end up thinking, when you're reading these liberation theologists, where they say, no, Jesus was really just another rebel, that's what he was, that's why we should worship him, then you think, well, why on earth are you religious at all? There is a contradiction in it. It's not, see, the religion, although we can understand why the religious ideas can be held at the same time as you're fighting back, that's not to say that's a different thing from saying the religious ideas help you to fight back. Even amongst the liberation theologists, it seems to me, the idea that they still cling to some sort of God still stops them from fighting back further. And so, very finally, I'd say this: what should the attitude be? I mean, Trotsky, in this brilliant book, Problems of Everyday Life, he talks about the wrong attitude. What is the wrong attitude towards religion that the Communist Party should take? And he cites the Norwegian Communist Party, who've been a little bit sort of fervent in their anti-religiousness, and he talks about a Norwegian fisherman that got up because he'd been told, look, you just can't be religious. Now, the Norwegian fishermen apparently had particularly sort of backward methods of fishing and so on, and therefore that made them particularly religious. They believed that, we have to pray very hard to God or we get no fish at all. And he was told, right, no, you can't. This Norwegian fisherman was told, no, you can't believe in God. You're supposed to be in the Communist International. And apparently he got up at a meeting, the Norwegian fisherman, and said, it comes down to this: either I must be for the Communist International and go without God and fish, or I must with a heavy heart leave, and so I have to leave. Now, Trotsky concludes that probably wasn't the best approach to take with the Norwegian fishing industry. And there is, of course, a Marxist approach which is different, that says it's extraordinary. The Romanian Revolution began, the marvellous thing, when a Hungarian priest, Hungarians traditionally disliked by the Romanians, all the sort of ethnic tensions and so on, and the Hungarian priest was defended by the Romanians. These sorts of things, I mean, just a quick example of during the Kosovo War, there's a Greek church near where I live, we went up there, marvellous sort of 20 minutes talking to these people. 7 of them came to the meeting, including the priest in full regalia. One of them got up, made a brilliant speech. That, I think, is a Marxist approach to religion. I'm not trying to, say our little area of the Socialist Workers' Party is brilliant, but I think, that was, broadly speaking, the right thing to go along there to do that. There was, I'll just finish with 2 little quotes here. First of all, Trotsky, who says he was talking, in fact, about one satirical magazine, when he said, issue after issue, you bore on, railing and fighting against Jehovah and Allah and God. How pointless this is. And clearly that was. On the other end, he says that the complete abolition of religion will be achieved only when there is a fully developed socialist system. That is a technology that frees man from any degrading dependence upon nature. It can be attained only under social relationships that are free from mystery, that are thoroughly lucid and do not oppress people. Religion translates the chaos of nature and the chaos of social relations into the language of fantastic images. Only the abolition of this earthly chaos can end forever its religious reflection. A conscious, reasonable, planned guidance of social life in all its aspects will abolish for all time mysticism and devilry. And as a result of that, the Bolshevik decree on religion in 1918 said that every citizen may adhere to any religion or adhere to none. Limitations before the law related to this faith or non-adherence to any faith are abolished. Free practice of religious customs is safeguarded insofar as it does not disturb the public peace and does not infringe upon the rights of citizens of the Soviet Republic. Those two quotes, I think, sum up the Marxist attitude towards the religion. It's the sigh of the oppressed. It is irrational, but it's the sigh of the oppressed. It's the heart of the heartless world. You can believe in what you want. Really, it's how you relate to the social relations in society that determine whether or not you go backwards or forwards. And when you go forwards, and when the whole of humanity goes forwards, that, I believe, will mean that religion will finally wither away.
All right, comrades, I'll call people to the mic two at a time. I'm going to tap after 2 minutes and again after 3, although of course you can speak for less than that if you want to. The first speaker will be Mr. Joseph Curry, and the second will be Ewan MacDonald. And while Mr. Joseph Curry is coming down to the microphone, read out a question. Religion in its purest form was the start of revolutionary thinking. Do you think Jesus was a communist? Mr. Curry, is that you? Yeah. If you just come down there, thanks.
Hello, can you hear me okay? Right. I agree with everything Mark Steele said, especially when he mentioned about the Catholic Church brainwashing children. I happen to be, I don't know, in a unique position, but I'd like to share 3 minutes of my life with you, because that's all I'm allowed. But I know what he's talking about because I was one of those children that they tried to brainwash. I was brought up in Nazareth House in Aberdeen, orphans' home, and I was a subject of abuse, both sexually and in other ways. Some of you may have heard this story, you may have read about it, it's been in the Scottish press. 458 people in Scotland at the Nazareth House homes are now suing the Catholic Church for the treatment that was given out to them in their earlier years in these homes. Now, Nazareth House was run by Jesuit priests. I don't know their history, but one day I will find out. Obviously, it must have started in Nazareth in Israel. But I did something I have to confess that when I was 13 years of age, I kept a note about what was happening to me. You could call it a diary. And I hid it in the brickwork of Nazareth House in Aberdeen. Now, this diary contains certain things which, unfortunately, I can't go into for legal reasons. But let's just say, when I remembered about this diary from 1967, that was 32 years ago, my lawyer and myself had to fight tooth and nail, reported it to the police, but they said it's not in the public interest that this diary should be recovered, whatever they mean by that. It's now apparently a private home. You have to pay to stay there. It's grown-up people. But anyway, we did find the diary, and since the recovery of that diary, I have now made a further statement to Strathclyde Police. And in this statement, I have named a certain, we'll call him a father, because I only knew him as a father then, who I told about the abuse. He is now a bishop, and let's just say within the next few weeks, there may be a certain resignation. Now, I'd just like to read you something. I think I've only got about 30 seconds left. You may have heard of this programme, the Tonight programme, with Trevor MacDonald. I sent a statement to Mr. Mike Lewis, and I'll make it brief. And I told him about this Nazareth House, just what I've shared with you. And I signed and dated this statement the 7th of July, 1999. The statement reads as follows. I do not want any money for this story, even although I am unemployed and on state benefit, for the simple following reason. They stole my childhood from me, but they can't steal my memories. They are not for sale. I want the world to know what went on in these Nazareth houses and who ultimately was responsible for all this abuse? The Roman Catholic Church. Thank you.
Right, okay, I'm sorry to cut short, but I want to try and get through as many speakers as possible. Ewan MacDonald just wants me to read out this question, so could Jenny Witt get ready to speak, please? The question, and perhaps you might want to think about this, Jenny, because I don't know the answer to this. Is it true that in Ireland they don't pay water rates because the government can't prove that God doesn't provide water? And the second question, Ewan MacDonald's question was, is it possible for a socialist to be a Christian? After Jenny, it's Chris Harman.
I'll talk to you later, Ewan, and that wasn't fair. The story that Mark Steele started on, the saint, just briefly to complete that story, and I'm not sure if Emma McCann is here at the moment, but I'm sure if he is, he'll forgive me for sort of relaying this anecdote. He was saying, the guy who's on the way to sainthood is called Padre Pio, and in what's sort of the estate sale of that particular order, there were people knocking on people's doors around Eamon's area, saying, look, we've got this glove that Padre Pio used to wear, and if you wave it over somebody's face, it'll bless them and it'll make them better. Do you have a sick person in the house? And it happened that Eamon's daughter was sick at the time, and with typical sort of McCann kind of fervour, he said, look, my good man, I think the best thing from a child would be not to wave a glove over her head that's carrying decades of pus and smut and things on it. So with those words, the guy was dispatched. But it's Padre Pio, remember that. And I think what Mark mentioned there about the remark about Hitler is worth remembering too. I just wanted to make a different point in terms of the political nature of the church, obviously particularly in Ireland, but also in different areas, in other areas, and also the flexibility of the church. I think the church has to catch up with ideas, and we've seen it in terms of gay priests and women priests, etc., and ordinations of women. But in Ireland, particularly with the Drumcree issue, I think since last year, since the Quinn brothers were burnt to death in a sectarian petrol bomb attack, there has been a clear mood amongst Protestants that they do not want confrontation on the same level at Drumcree or over Drumcree or over other marches anywhere else in Northern Ireland. What we've seen this year has been a massive turn by the Church of Ireland. The Synod, which is the Parliament in a sense of the Church of Ireland, has voted to make the Orangemen give pledges of good behaviour, that there will be no violence, etc. at Drumcree. They've put ideological pressure on the Orange Order, and the Church of Ireland and the Presbyterian Church are the mainstay of the Orange Order. You could divide the membership probably 50-50. And there's been a huge amount of pressure on the Orangemen and also on the Reverend at Drumcree, who's also a Church of Ireland member, but who's so far refused to lock out the Orangemen. He said, my doors will stay open for these people because anybody's entitled to have a church service. But the Church of Ireland basically has been under pressure, and it's been a clear sign. I mean, if we talk about the fact that people's ideas come out of their, the material situation, and that the church isn't coming out of nothing, that the church is, in a sense, a product of people's living experience, the church has been having to catch up massively with Protestants on the ground who are saying, look, we just want to live in peace with our Catholic neighbours. We don't care about, sectarianism. We've got differences, but we can tolerate it. And that's what the Church of Ireland has been having to do this year. And that's been a very, very interesting move, because the ideological pressure, I think, that came out of the Synod has been contributing to the fact that there were very, very few people at Drumcree this year compared to last year, and that there's been less kind of political trouble and so on, So that's been very interesting. And I think it's really, yes, I mean, we see that, religion, I think, is going down in sort of significance, I think, amongst younger people in Northern Ireland, but it's still very, very much a force on the ground, and having said that, looking at the South, looking at the Republic of Ireland, I think that's worth bearing in mind, how quickly a religion and how quickly a church can crumble under things like an abortion case or under things like single parents, the fact that there are more single parents in Ireland today than there ever were before, and that the church just cannot tally, it can't handle those issues anymore. It can't go on about contraception all the time and ignore the fact that the vast majority of people use contraception in the South. And I think hopefully in the North we'll see something similar, that within a matter of years, maybe a decade, the church on either side, the Catholic and the Protestant church, will go down in significance, and that socialists and left-wing ideas and class politics will make a much bigger inroad into the political landscape there.
Thank you. Chris will be followed by John Parrington.
I think what's very important in what Mark said is we have to understand the contradictory nature of religion. And for me, it's exemplified in the Catholic Church. Because the Catholic Church was, at the time of the rise of capitalism, the rise of the bourgeoisie, the Catholic Church was the most reactionary defender of the old feudal order. And even into the 20th century, if you look at somewhere like Spain, you find during the Civil War, the Catholic Church, outside the Basque Country, everywhere else in Spain, the Catholic Church was absolutely on the side of Franco. Catholics from right across Europe volunteered to go and fight in Spain in order to fight alongside the troops of Hitler and Mussolini in order to smash the Republic and to smash the workers' movement. And even more recently, I mean, one of the people the Pope is trying to make into a saint is one of the leading figures of an organisation called Opus Dei, which is the most reactionary organisation in the Catholic Church. Used to be stacked, Franco's cabinet used to be stacked full of Opus Dei members, and so on and so forth. At the same time, I have to recall the last time I went into a monastery. Now, I must admit, there must have been elements of superstition left in my mind, because I half expected the heavens to open up when I walked in there. It was a monastery in Spain. It was in 1976. It was only about 4 months after Franco had died, 6 months after he'd executed 5 opponents of the regime, and about a month after workers had been shot down in the streets of Vitoria. And I was going to an underground revolutionary communist meeting. It was held in this monastery. It was a very strange affair, because we were meant to be socialists for Christians for socialism, which apparently was legal under the last days of Francoism, whereas revolutionary communism, of course, wasn't. And we were locked in this room, and for me it was a bit like hell, actually. I was in a monastery, because I'm a rabid non-smoker. I was stuck in this room with 50 people smoking the Spanish equivalent of gauloises, non-stop. All the windows were shut for 2 hours at a time, while they intensely debated, are we for the Republic or for the Workers' Republic? What is our attitude towards the trade unions? What's the lessons of Bolshevism for Spain today? Then every 2 hours they'd open the windows and we'd have to sing hymns. Although I must say, the Spanish Christians for socialism notion of hymns was a bit strange as well, because one of them seemed to have the words, "My Bonnie lies over the ocean," and certainly had the tune. But what I found even more interesting is most of the people there were duping it. But there were people who had been devout Christians. In the Franco period, although Christianity had supported the regime in the counter-revolution, in 1936 to 1939, the murder of 500,000 Republicans and socialists and so forth, during the Franco era, the mass organisations of the Catholic Church became the only place in which it was possible to begin to discuss socialist ideas. The Christian Workers' Association became one of the most radical organisations in opposition to the regime. There were actually a situation of priests. People who become priests in the church became revolutionary communists. And it wasn't true in Spain, it was actually true internationally in the period 68 to 1975 or thereabouts. You found one of the organisations in Chile on the far left during the Allende period was the Christian left. One of the roots of the Lotta Continua organisation in Italy was the revolutionary Christians. One of the first occupations in Italy in 68 was in the Christian University in, I think, in Milan. And it was this coming together of people whose consciousness, Christianity did seem to them, although the church itself was extremely reactionary, Christianity talked to them about altruism, caring about other people, higher values than materialism, and so on and so forth. We have to understand the contradictory nature of it. One of the questions asked is, can a Christian become a socialist? Yes, a Christian can become a socialist. But at the same time, those who are Marxists also believe that to really become a socialist, to really fight this system, you have to tear away the mystical veil. I mean, I agree absolutely with Marx said, but when he says you have to go beyond the Enlightenment. But nevertheless, for someone who becomes a socialist, to read the writings which do tear apart the contradictions in the Bible. I mean, my favourite is Mark Twain, who's brilliant on it. But Voltaire, and the other writers who tear apart the contradictions are useful, because they make you begin to see the Bible doesn't make sense. There must be something else which makes sense, which has these values of altruism, of community, of working together, of solidarity and so forth, which is better than the Bible and much more materialist.
Thanks. John will be followed by Anne Wood. Just a couple of questions, John. Should socialists defend sects or cults when they're attacked by the state? And most of the architectural structures we've got seem to be built for religious purposes. How do you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, just to reply to the earlier question about working with Christians, or being a socialist if you're a Christian, I'll work with anyone from any religion if they want to fight capitalism. That's the main thing. But I think socialists have got a duty to actually argue against religion, because it is, I think, just like a blinker, not letting us see the world the way it really is. And one of the crucial things that I think has allowed us to say that is the role of science. I think science has played a fantastic role in actually showing that there's no need for a God, and that's why I think it's actually quite important we don't go along with the idea that you sometimes hear that science is just like the new religion. Because scientific facts are used to, or supposed scientific facts are used to justify all sorts of horrible things from racism to GM crops. People draw the conclusion that science itself is not to be listened to. And I think that'd be a mistake, because science was a major way of actually, showing religion was completely wrong, and there wasn't actually such thing as a God. And it's things like Galileo were crucial in actually getting rid of the idea that there was necessarily this rigid social order that was mirrored in the heavens as it was down on the earth. And obviously the theory of evolution, completely got away from the idea that somehow we had to be created by a God. I think that's especially important when there's actually people on the left, people like Stephen Jay Gould, who's written some brilliant books, attacking the selfish gene theory and things like that, who seem to have caved in recently to the Catholic Church, and now saying we should let bygones be bygones about what the Catholic Church did against religion. I think that's a massive mistake. You don't have to look at the massive struggle that those scientists were involved in. Some lost their lives. Galileo almost lost his life. There's a guy called Bruno who did some amazing scientific discoveries, but also he was very close to discovering the circulation of the blood. He was actually burned at the stake. I don't think those people would be quite as willing to forgive and forget, and certainly that's an important thing today, given that in America, for instance, at the same time as religious groups are attacking, say, anti-abortion clinics, they're also attacking the embryology research labs, where actually they're trying to help people get around infertility. So it just shows you they're not really bothered about normal people's problems of health. All they're bothered about is some kind of abstract idea of the living being. Now, just to finish, really, I think the reason people can say, well, what's the difference between science and religion, is when you get all these nonsense theories about the selfish gene and the rest of it. And I think that's why, at the same time as we say science has shown religion to be wrong, we also criticise the version of science that we often get in capitalist society, the idea that, the rigid order, like the poor are always going to be poor, the rest of it is now, as it used to be echoed by religious people, is now echoed by, people like Richard Dawkins and the rest, and other people like them, in a completely unscientific way. I'll leave it there.
Anne will be followed by Mary Phillips. So Anne, sorry, there's more questions coming in. What is your thesis about New Age religions? And this one is about... You don't have to answer this. I believe that many of those who are making complaints about religion, including many Marxists, are reacting to Judeo-Christian tradition, which is spiritually bankrupt as well as politically corrupt. Many Eastern religions, I would argue, present us with a more human and spiritual approach, which we might develop upon as we have been developing politically, scientifically and philosophically throughout history.
Yeah, I just wanted to look at a bit about where religion actually comes from in a sort of pre-class society, and what difference it was then to what it actually represents now. Because if you look at it as just a sort of set of ideas about the forming of consciousness and how humans developed, and when they started to think about things like life and death and Neanderthals, but having culture and burials, and you could term that as religion. You could say that was actually a form of religion. It was about ideas. They couldn't explain the world. They didn't know why things happened, why there were sort of lightning, thunderstorms, why drought would come or whatever, why people lived, why they died. And religion, if you like, if you call it religion, tried to explain that because of the lack of control over nature, really. And I think, sort of culture or religion in that sense changes when you get the growth of class society, that religion then starts to become about the subjection of people, about religion being used to then rule over people, to control their ideas. Because I think as technology develops, someone talked about science being able to explain the world now, being able to explain all the things that happen, being able to explain why, you could go to Mars, why there's no heaven, why you don't need a God. Those things can start to break down religion. I think it has. We are living in a less religious society than we used to live in, when people had less control over their lives, when people had less control over nature. And on the one hand, I want to see religion as a consciousness developing in humanity, in pre-class society, and I maybe would like Mark to comment on that, what he thinks about that. I was reading Richard Leakey's book in Origins Reconsidered, and he seems to see it as a positive development, culture, ideas, and religion or whatever. But now it's actually stopping people from being able to take control. And you can say that, moving on to a society where we've got more control will obviously, well, not obviously, but, in my mind, will start to stop the need for religion. And in people's ordinary lives under capitalism, the more you can actually control the way things work, the more you can start to fight as a socialist those ideas that you've clung on to for a long time, that have tried to explain why kids die, why this famine, all the rest of it. Oh, it's God, in the end of the day we'll get something better. I think that in itself, the more you fight, the more you think, right, I can do something about this, religion will start to disappear for individuals. But obviously in a move towards a socialist society, that religion will wither away.
Thank you. One more question. What do you think about how Islam praises science and the development of it and admits that there was a Big Bang? After Mary, it will be Dick Pitt who'll have to be the last speaker.
I went to one of those schools like Mark did, where we had prayers every morning, and before this disgusting meal called school dinners, we sang Grace. And when I was about 14 or 15, the headmistress made a new rule that everybody had to sing Grace before this meal. Well, I'd always sung it, and I had the loudest voice in the school, and I thought, bugger that, I'm not singing that anymore. So I shut up, and my friend, who was the only other person who ever sang it, was away that day, so there was complete dead silence during this Grace. And we sat down, and the teacher came up to me and she said, Mary, I noticed you didn't sing Grace. And I said, well, no, I don't believe in God. Ah! It was like, a thunderbolt had come and hit the school. She went away, and I never heard any more about it. But I thought, having got that far, maybe I should try and stop having to go to assembly. Well, first I tried a bit of a kind of wimpy way, and I said to this friend of mine, I'd like to become Jewish. But then it turned out that meant, going to all kinds of religious things at the weekend, and it was no better, really, than being a Christian. So I sent a message via my class teacher to the head teacher saying I'd like to be excused from assembly because I don't believe in God. And the message I got back was that she did not recognise the existence of atheists or agnostics.
I believe in you.
And I was to go on going to these things. And we had a study of comparative religions, and people used to come from other religions and give us talks about once a term, and the head teacher, who was the scripture teacher, would sit kind of at the front of the lesson waiting while they talked, and all the time that these people were telling us about their religion, she was going so it was pretty clear, which side she was on, and that she was only doing it as some kind of moral thing. And now I keep in my front hall at home, in my flat, a collection of leaflets about socialism and petitions, so that when people come to my door, Jehovah's Witnesses or stuff, I can give them these things and say, take this away and read them, or sign this petition, and they mostly leave in a hurry. And the last thing is, little girls suddenly started coming up to me, much younger girls at school, and saying, is your name Mary Bristow? That was my name then. And is it true you don't believe in God? And are you a communist? So I went out and bought a copy of the Daily Worker, because I thought I'd better find out what it was. And they were exactly the same about Stalin. It seemed to me that Stalin was just another kind of God. And I can only say that I was delighted that I found the SWP in the end, and we should fight against all that rubbish.
Jeff, I'll have to ask you to keep it short, okay?
Yeah, very briefly. I just want to talk about the different facets of Christianity. The slave owners in Jamaica introduced Christianity to Jamaica very, very consciously, and what they said was the effect on the slaves were they worked harder and produced better sugar. The actual priests that were arguing the Christian faith, had slaves of their own, and if the slaves didn't turn up to the Christian ceremonies, they wouldn't give them any food. Later on, sort of within the period of decades, different strands of Christianity came. The Methodists came. The Methodists split. One faction was racist, the others weren't. Then the Southern Baptists came, and then finally there were some religious people from Dominica who just happened to have a very successful slave revolt. For the slaves in Jamaica, what sort of ideas are they going to pick up? What sort of Christianity are they going to choose from this great long spread? Well, of course, the bits in the Bible talking about, God being opposed to slavery and a slave revolt out of Egypt and so forth. And Jesus says to the young man, sell your shirt and get a sword and this sort of thing. So that when the slave revolt did come, it had very, very firmly a Christian thing. It was the Baptist revolt. The reaction of the slave owners to the Christian revolt was a colonial Christian union. Banished every single other Christian church, and they were jailing people, burned downing the chapels and the rest of it. And that, to me, is the key thing. If you pick up the Bible, you can find absolutely anything that you want in it. And that, for us, is dead crystal clear. For the last 3 meetings, we've had 3 separate individuals all being religious. And we have to be very, very firm. What drives some people to take up religion, to want a better world, they think that comes from their religious beliefs. And we have to be crystal clear that you can fight capitalism, you can be a socialist and a Christian and a Muslim. There are 2 of them that were Muslims. But we also have to be absolutely crystal clear that you need more than a sort of emotional appeal that things aren't right and we want a better world. We have to have a scientific, conscious understanding about how we organise for that better world. And those are the 2 strands.
Okay, there's quite a few announcements, so I'm going to read them quickly. The meeting on Luxembourg and the Revolutionary Party at 7 p.m. this evening has been moved from the Chemistry Auditorium to Nunn Hall on level 4 in the Institute that's in this building. There will be a meeting for all members and supporters from Brighton District today at 5:15 in Jeffrey Hall. There'll be a meeting for all students at 5 p.m. today in the Upper Hall in Ulu. Howard Zinn's play Marx in Soho will be on in the Logan Hall tonight at 9 p.m. Get there early because it will probably get full. And all branches must collect posters and leaflets for the Labour Party lobby from room 3F Ulu at 5 o'clock today. And now I'll ask Mark to sum up.
Right, well, I'll start by sort of reasserting the premise of what I was trying to say, really, which is that the problem with religion is not religion. Religion is an ideology that comes from the group that's expressing it, their social position in society. So, for example, there's an argument that comes up, you quite often hear this, I do anyway, people say, a Buddhist religion. No, the Buddhist religion there's something which is more progressive about it. Or any religion, it could be the Hindu, there's some good things in the Hindu religion. Now, the thing is that religion is so flexible, it comes from sort of these, the Bible, for example, huge sort of load of stuff in there. You can take whatever you like out of context and prove that it fits your particular ideology. Therefore, it is not the original, there is no such thing really as a progressive or a backward religion, it doesn't seem to me, in terms of its original ideology. Buddhism can be used by the ruling class to justify their practice, or people that are turning to more radical ideas can say, oh no, there are these good things about Buddhism, about community and so on and so forth. For example, the New Age, I don't mean to sort of condemn all Buddhists by this, for example, but this thing that was growing in the 80s, New Age Buddhism. Someone mentioned what I think of the New Age religions. The New Age Buddhists of the 80s, I do recall coming across it. In fact, it was infuriating. I mean, you start talking to people and they seem all right, and then all of a sudden they denounce that they were Buddhists, and they've got these sort of I remember going around someone's house and they had this sideboard thing which had scrolls in it, and they had to keep these scrolls in a sideboard and chant at it, do this business at it, about 3 times a day. Right, all right, now pretty crackers, but there we are. You can chant at sideboards if you want, except that I suppose it doesn't do a great deal of harm, except that what they used to chant for material possessions. That's what I remember. There was a whole series of these New Age religions. Chant at it for a bigger television, chant at it for promotion, chant at it, can I have a bigger car, please? It's only 2 years old. I don't know, these sort of bizarre... Now, why did that happen? It wasn't the problem wasn't with Buddhism. The problem was with the sort of middle-class yuppie attitudes of the 80s that created these people, and therefore often as well I think a lot of them try to play, if they were radicalised by the 1968 generation, then some of these people try to sort of claim that there's still some tinge of radicalism to prove that they haven't abandoned all the principles they once have, and build a bridge from that to their utter money-grubbing, horrible little yuppie 1980s lifestyles that they were living at the time, and so on. The problem not with religion, but with their social position. And if you approach all the questions on those, if you approach all the questions on that basis, that I think makes the most sense. Sects or cults. If we say, the thing that the Bolsheviks said at the end there, of course you have right to religious freedom, then therefore, no matter how bizarre it appears, and you go off and you live in a little barn in Texas somewhere, then you do have the right to practice that, it seems to me, without a huge bloody chunk of the American army coming in and blowing the place to pieces. No, then obviously, if you look at the social relations there, here are some people, the sigh of the oppressed. I know they were very peculiar, but the sigh of the oppressed, as Marx said, the heart in a heartless world. These people, very often the poorest people, the people that go into these suicide cults and so on, almost always the poorest people that turn to something. Something gives me a little bit of comfort, albeit it's the belief that there's a spaceship hiding behind a comet who's going to take me to another planet if I die. A bit strange, but that is what a very heartless world we live in when you choose that as an alternative, it seems. And all of these things. So therefore, if you say, was Jesus a communist? Now, the point is, what was Jesus' social position? Now, clearly he wasn't a communist, because it makes no sense at all to say anyone was a communist back at that period. But he was, maybe he was a rebel. We don't really know, do we? Maybe he was a rebel who opposed threw out the moneylenders and all. He did these things, all very good. The point about worshipping Jesus, though, it seems to me, is that it's a sort of way of clinging on to religion, to say these people who have moved extremely radically, but particularly some of the sort of people in South America and so on, who want to cling on to the idea that there is a religion that they can tie into their own radicalism. It's a way of not quite breaking. The simple reason that if you just say that Jesus was a rebel and that he fought the Romans and that's it, why on earth would you worship him? We think that the Luddites were great fighters. We don't worship the bloody Luddites, do we? We don't say, there's going to be a day every Sunday or 11 o'clock we're going to get a shearing machine and smash it up with a hammer. So it makes no sense, I don't know, we could say all sorts of sort of radical people in the past, Tom Paine or so on. We see them as part of a sort of progression of ideas. We don't worship them. In that respect, it makes no sense. Once you remove the virgin birth and the resurrection and turning water into wine and feeding the people with the fishes and the loaves, once you remove that away from Jesus, then you really aren't going to worship him, it seems to me. So the same with science. The thing with science, without science, there can be no material way of looking at the world. That is true. But with science, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to replace religion, because religion doesn't come from that. It's not rational. It's not an entirely rational way of looking at the world, religion. Therefore, it's not going to be the case that you say, you're never going to win. I don't believe anyone's ever won an argument about religion by arguing. You try it sometimes, you're a bit pissed and you get in a minicab and the bloke starts telling you about, the dinosaurs were God's joke and starts talking this and you get in an argument. Now, I've never ever, I don't believe, heard of anyone who's had an argument about Darwin and so on with one of these people and found they've gone, you're absolutely right. I've just never realised. So that's what natural selection means. I'm going to go to the church and tell them I don't want anything more to do with them. It clearly doesn't happen. And so all those arguments, Islam and science and so on, of course they can coexist with science, because you can have these radical ideas about the world. This is why great Galileo, a marvellous job of undermining religion, still believed in God. Isaac Newton, marvellous job of undermining religion, still believed in God. So did Darwin, so did Copernicus, so even does Stephen J. Hawking. And so, if what the comrade earlier said right is, I didn't quite say this, but so apparently does Stephen Jay Gould, which is a sad story. But there we are. Of course you can coexist with these things. Therefore, to conclude, what I would say is this. See, religion, therefore, can coexist with radical ideas. However, usually it is a break on those ideas, because it says we cannot control our own destiny, and total liberation of mankind is about control of our own destiny. Religion, by definition, puts our destiny somewhere else. There's a marvellous bit in E.P. Thompson's book where he takes up the argument that says that Methodism was a radical religion of the working class, because various historians and labour movement people that liked the Methodist Church, again, tried to sort of hang on to some sort of religion while they were radical. They said if you look at the years in which the most radical movements existed in the early 1800s, they were also the years of the rise of Methodism. And it was true. 1812, the Luddites and so on, 1819, the Peterloo Massacre, but even going back before that. These were the years when Methodism grew the fastest, and it was true. Except E.P. Thompson, diligent as he was, said, if you look carefully, that is right. But when Methodism, if you look at the months, Methodism grew after those movements went down to defeat. That is the time when the Luddites were hung. It was the months after that suddenly thousands of people flocked to the Methodist Church. It was the months after the Peterloo Massacre, not in the growing movements for reform, and so on. These were the periods when most people, look, we wanted a material sigh, if you like, a heart that we could fight for. It's gone down to defeat. We'll turn to the heart in the heartless world, religion. And that is why it does infuriate me that we live, what is wrong with religion in modern Britain? What is wrong with, that miserable, what's wrong with religion in modern Britain is not entirely religion. What's wrong with it is this miserable sign of a declining, miserable, bloody, poxy country, England, suburban, Cliff Richard stars on Sunday, songs of praise. Fucking Harry bloody Seacombe religion, Tony Blair, it sums it up. He personifies the rigid, miserable, pathetic, passionless, grotty little religion. The man who stands up and says, well, you have to abolish Clause 4 because it is out of date. Don't you it was written in 1919. What has it got to say to the modern world? This is a bloke who bloody every Sunday reads bits out from the New Testament. Across it. When does he think that was written? Does he think Peter Mandelson wrote it in 1988, for fuck's sake? The problem with Tony Blair is not that he's religious, the problem is that he is of a class position that means that his religion reflects it. It's miserable, it's pathetic, it's got to go. That's what's wrong with Tony Blair.